y'all. It's Michelle with SLP Full Disclosure. We are back for a wonderful new year. And to kick off our season, we are going to be joined today by an amazing guest, another Southerner from South Carolina. So I'm super excited. I have talked to her before. She doesn't have quite the Southern drawl that I do, but that's okay. We are joined today by Erika Trump from South Carolina. Erika, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. All right, before we get started, I want to read your bio just to let our guests know a little bit about you. So Erika has been a pediatric occupational therapist since 2016. She attended Towson University, where she completed her master's in occupational therapy and a post-baccalaureate certification in autism studies. She moved to Charleston, South Carolina after graduation, where she now runs her own private practice, Spark Pediatric Therapy. She specializes in working with children who have challenges in sensory integrative processing and nervous system regulation. She prides herself on her ability to connect with her clients and their families and provide a child-led, play-based style of therapy. She is passionate about learning as much as she can to better serve her families and enjoys continuing to learn more about the complex world of sensory integration. So that's the buzzword right there. So I think after reading your bio, our listeners probably know why we're having Erika on today. So sensory integration, dysregulation, buzzwords that we are hearing so much about, Erika. Tell us exactly what sensory integration is. What does sensory integration mean? Because we hear sensory integration, dysregulation, sensory processing, and all of those words can kind of be used together separately. Do they mean the same thing? What do those words mean?
So sensory integration at its core is about how we interpret information from within our own bodies and within the environment to be able to respond and interact with the world. And there are a lot of terms in that field, even within occupational therapy. There are a lot of terms that people use interchangeably or don't always use in the way that they were intended. And I think it is really hard to tease out, what the correct word is or if we're using the word we intended.
Right.
In that situation.
Right. And that's where I get so confused because I hear sensory processing, I hear sensory integration, I hear dysregulation, and all of those things, they mean the same thing, but they also mean something very different, correct?
That's true. Sensory integration and sensory processing are essentially talking about very similar concepts. And they were used by different people. Sensory processing is sort of the newer way to describe it.
Okay.
But sensory integration is what it was originally called. So sensory integration and sensory processing, whether you're referring to them as the concept or the disorder, are really describing the same thing.
Right. And that's just how our bodies detect the environment, the sights, the sounds, the feelings, the smells. That's kind of how our body interprets all of that stuff. Is that correct?
Yes. And also within our own body, we process what's happening in our muscles, how our head is positioned in relation to gravity. There's lots of things we process internally too. Okay. And lots of those things we process without ever having thought about them because they work for most people pretty efficiently. And when they're not working efficiently, we don't always respond to stimuli in the environment or interact with the environment in the way that we might expect.
Right. And a lot of kids have difficulty with that key piece right there. And it comes out in different ways, right? So that's when you start seeing the behaviors. That's when you start seeing the tantrums. That's when you start seeing those type things. Is that correct?
Yes. Those are my very favorite kids to work with because I think it's really easy for people that are caring for these kids to look at those behaviors and say, that was, it's a choice that they made or they're in control of what they're doing. But in reality, at the very foundation of our nervous system, we have to be able to feel safe and process sensory input efficiently to be able to interact in the appropriate way because most kids aren't having behaviors as a choice. It's something that their body is responding to on a really subconscious level, even though that might not be the way we might expect them to respond.
So as you said that, it's like it's not a choice they're making, it's just how their bodies respond. I do not like to be in the sand on the beach. I don't like sand on my feet. I don't like it on my hands. But I guess as an adult, I've learned to process that. I'm not falling out and having a temper tantrum. I'm not screaming and like ripping my socks off or ripping my shoes off. I just avoid the beach because I don't like the sand on me. But these kids who don't, maybe sometimes they don't have the communication and they don't have the ability to communicate, hey, I don't like that. And it could be as simple as something as a tag in the back of their shirt, right? And we've always heard, all of us have worked with kids that have done that. How do we, I think this is going to be the biggest question of the podcast. How do we differentiate between those kids who are having behaviors because it is a choice versus those kids who are having these behaviors because they are having difficulty processing their sensory environment?
I think a little bit of that comes down to a little bit knowing what is expected in typical child development. But
here's the key, that normal child development. And I've said this before on the podcast, you have to know what's normal and what's typical before you can determine what is not typical.
Right. So when I'm working with kids, I often talk to their parents about, at the core, what sensory integration is. But I also let them know that sensory differences are normal too. I am a person that doesn't like loud. I'm a person that doesn't like bright, but I do like a lot of deep pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But those things aren't interfering with my life. And I think that's really the key for differentiating for me is, what's impacting their ability to do the things that they need to do on a daily basis.
Right. And I think one misconception is, I know you have the autism specialty. I think one big misconception is that only children with autism can have a sensory integration disorder. And that's not true. Because you were just talking about some of the sensory differences that you have. Now, do you use the word sensory processing disorder or do you use the term sensory differences? And should we differentiate between that? Is it just a PC kind of thing?
It's a little bit tricky because sensory processing disorder, sensory integrative dysfunction is not a diagnosis that's in a manual. So you can't, go to your pediatrician and get a diagnosis of sensory processing disorder. The compromise that the DSM made was to add sensory features under the label of autism, but they're not mutually exclusive. I kind of picture it like a Venn diagram where sensory processing is on one side and autism is on the other, and there is an overlap. Lots of kids who are autistic also have sensory differences.
Right.
But you can also have autism without the sensory features, and you can have sensory differences without meeting the criteria for autism.
Right. That's right. And I think that's one of the things is that when we see these kids come in as speech pathologists and they have these big behaviors, what are some behaviors that you typically see? Or is there something that is pretty is there a telltale sign that you have in your clinic that when the kid comes in, you're like, that's sensory, or that's lack of communication, or that's because I've never been told no. So those are all three, you're laughing. Those are three very different things in a clinic setting and with kiddos in general. So is there a telltale sign that you have and you're just like, ding, 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 that's it?
Honestly, I don't think I would say that there is a telltale sign. I definitely have a feeling when I first start to interact with a kid. I can tell pretty quickly, but I think that's just through years of doing what I do.
Right. Experience.
And I think it really, does take that trained eye to see that difference and really dig in depth with the parents, the caregivers, the teachers, and see, what trends are we noticing? When is, the behavior happening? What happened right before that behavior? What happens when you try to support them through that big feeling? How long is it taking them to calm down? And really seeing, what areas of life is that impacting for them. But I really think it takes me several sessions to really have a thorough understanding, even a working understanding of what's happening inside their little brains.
Yeah, because a lot of times they can't communicate to you what's going on, right?
Yeah, communication is a big one. Even for kids that can communicate, they don't always have the words to describe what's happening. I had a kid recently who's 13, and he's very verbal and cognitively appropriate for his age. And, his mom didn't know that he was so sensitive to the sound of chewing.
Oh.
But But I don't think he had necessarily put that together before that time. So even kids that are verbal, but it's definitely exacerbated in kids that aren't verbal because they don't have a way to tell you, wow, this is too loud, or this doesn't feel good, or I need more of this.
Yeah. Wow, that's so interesting. How did you narrow it down to it's someone chewing? Isn't there like a term that people that don't like chewing, in there, where I don't know what the word is?
Misophonia.
Yes. I think I may have that too. I know my daughter does, because she will look at me and I'm like, what do you want me to do? Just like let it sit in my mouth until it's gone? I have to chew a potato chip, right?
Right.
So, but how did you go? I mean, what is your process of, as an occupational therapist with kids like that? What is your process of narrowing it down? Like, I think that's so random. So how did you figure that out?
In that instance, it was mom talking about how one of the things that they were still struggling with was meal times and going out to eat. And I think a lot of it just comes down to, things that I've seen in other kids, and you being able to ask the right questions and dig a little deeper and catch things that mom says or the child says that maybe they didn't necessarily make the connection.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of serves as a bridge between what the kid is feeling and then making sense of that so that everyone can have an understanding of how to best support these kids.
Okay. That's awesome. That's amazing. All right. Let's talk about dysregulation. How do you, because sensory integration, sensory differences, sensory processing, do those terms go hand in hand with dysregulation? Or is that something completely different? Because we always hear those terms pretty much in the same conversation.
Yes and no. Kids that have sensory differences, sensory integrative dysfunction, are often having trouble with regulation, but sensory is not the only thing that plays into regulation.
Right.
So at the foundation, regulation is about the ability to meet the demands of the environment and meet our own needs. And I think people often misinterpret regulated to mean calm, and that's not necessarily true. But it's about our ability to meet the demands of a situation. So when we're supposed to be sitting quietly at our desk doing our worksheet, regulated might look different than playing on the playground.
Right.
But it's about the ability to meet the demands of the environment. So when we talk about dysregulation, we're talking about a child having difficulty meeting those demands. And a lot of times we think about that as really big outward signs of, hitting or yelling or stomping their feet or running away. But sometimes it can be as subtle as, changes in their breath patterns or their heart rate or their pupil dilation, looking for those signs that their nervous system is responding really significantly to what's happening.
And I think that the term dysregulation, in my personal experience, I've been doing this 25 years, I think the word dysregulation is the one that's most often misused, because you've got these kiddos that are having these big emotions and they have little communication. They may or may not have autism, but the moment they have a meltdown, the term they're dysregulated. And then they always call the OT in, we need help with regulation. So, Erika, as an occupational therapist, when you have these kiddos, and as a speech language pathologist, we're working at the core of that language and communication piece. So how do you work hand in hand with your speech language pathologists to work with these kiddos that may have sensory differences and who are having some true dysregulation? And let me ask you this first before you answer that. Do you feel like the term dysregulation is often overused or misused?
It can be. And I think any term can be overused or misused when people don't necessarily understand where it's coming from. But I think it's not necessarily inappropriate to use it in lots of contexts that it is used, because dysregulation is just about, again, our ability to meet the demands of the environment. And that may happen because we don't have the capacity to manage that big emotion in that moment, even if it is something that we think they should be able to manage.
Right. And it also means that they may not they may have a sensory difference, or they may have sensory integration disorder or whatever, but they also may not just understand what's going on, and they may not understand the task at hand. Is that correct?
That is very true. And I think that's something that I work with other providers that are on a case with kids that I work with or their parents is really helping them step back and think about that child and where they're at developmentally to understand, is this task appropriate for them? Is it interesting to them? Is it meeting their sensory needs? Do they truly understand what's happening?
Right. That's a great point. Do they understand what is expected of them? How do you work a lot with speech language pathologists? Do you have SLPs in your clinic, or are you primarily working with SLPs and consulting with SLPs in schools, or how does that work with your practice?
Most of the kids I work with do have SLPs on board as well. I don't have SLPs in my practice right now, but at practices that I've worked with previously, I've worked really closely with speech therapists and their ability to support kids' regulation too, because communication is a big part of that, because it's a lot easier to maintain a regulated state if you can help people understand why you're dysregulated.
Right. What advice could you give our SLPs who are listening in working with these kids that in getting started, we've heard these terms, oh, they have sensory integration difficulties, or, oh, they get very dysregulated at, different times of the day. What advice can you give our SLPs who are listening? Where would you start? And let's keep in mind that not all of them are going to have access to someone like you who is an expert in this field. So where do they go for help? What can you tell them to do when they're getting started?
I think my number one piece of advice is just to get curious. And I think that can make such a world of difference to step back and say, okay, what are some possible reasons that this could be happening for this kiddo? Because how you respond is really going to make a significant difference in whether they're able to continue working on that particular sound or work on that social skill that you're trying to work on with them. But being able to get curious and think, I wonder if something about the environment's not working for them. I wonder if they need to move their body. I wonder if, this task is a little too complicated for them.
Right.
But I think also finding an occupational therapist in your area that you can consult with is so helpful. Even myself, I get regular mentoring, even though this is something that I do every day, because it's always helpful to have someone to bounce ideas off of. But it's tricky because we learn about sensory integration in OT school, but it's very, very surface level. And like most things that we do, it's a really, really complicated topic. I've been doing this for 8.5 years, and I still don't feel like I know as much as I really would like to, as I would like to know all the things. But, it's hard to know all the things you need to know coming out of school. So finding someone that has some more background training. But a lot of the sensory integration continuing education courses are open to speech therapists, which I think is really cool.
That is
and there
awesome.
are lots of speech therapists that I think are realizing how impactful that can be in their work. And I know on social media, there are a lot more speech therapists that are coming out and are more upfront about their inclusion of sensory integration practices in their practice.
Right. And no one case, you can't just say sensory integration looks like this and put it in a nice little box and say, when you see this, this, and this, then that's what it is, because none of them look the same, because we all process the environment differently, and even children. And I talked about this with a friend of mine about, can you imagine being a toddler, and every day when you wake up, and I may have even talked about it on the podcast, I can't remember, and waking up every day and the world being so brand new and all of these things. If I hear the garbage truck go down the road and it's the big loud noise, I know what that is. If I hear a siren, I know what that is. If I smell a candle or if I smell food, I know what all of those things are. But can you imagine being in a world where you're like, you hear a garbage truck and you're like, what is that? And not knowing what it is, and if it's frightening or if it's exciting or whatever. So I feel like that kind of is what sensory integration is that the world is different to everybody, because you may like the smell of vanilla, but I may not like the smell of vanilla. And so certain things, we respond differently to everything. And that is, and I'm the one that sleeps with a weighted blanket. I don't like the sand, and you don't like loud things. So it's just incredible, but you and I have the ability to communicate that. and I know to avoid it, and little kids don't. And they're put in situations every day to complete tasks, to sit quietly, to take turns, to, allow their kids, their friends, their peers to run around them. And that's hard. That can be very hard.
Yeah. And sensory integration is the foundation of so many things that we do. I think the term sensory gets used a lot in ways that it's not always accurate. But sensory integration in all of the research that has been done is the foundation of so many skills that we use every day. So when I am teaching parents for the first time about sensory integration, I'll describe it to them like a house. And I'll describe the sensory systems as the foundation of that house. And then all of the higher level things that they're seeing, like academics, behavior, self-care, social skills, all of those things as the roof of that house. So you can build a house on a cracked or shaky foundation, and that house will still stand up. But, we're from the South, so when the hurricanes blow through,
and the tornadoes.
Or the tornadoes come through, is that house going to be super strong and sturdy through that weather? Probably not. But if we can patch up that foundation, it makes it a lot easier to access those higher level cognitive skills. So even things like where my tongue is in my mouth to make a particular sound, or how to interpret someone else's facial expressions in a social interaction, or to sit still to do that worksheet in class. All of those things hinge a bit on our ability to process sensory information.
Yeah. And all of that is going to impact how we respond and what it looks like outwardly. Am I sitting quietly, or am I up running around? Am I on the floor? Am I tantruming? Can you think off the top of your head, maybe just a couple of things or techniques that you could give to our SLP listeners?
I think some of my go-to strategies that I use for kids and recommend to other providers and parents are heavy work activities. I think that's one of my go-tos, and I don't know that everyone always understands why they work the way that they do.
Yeah, tell us what a heavy work activity looks like.
Yeah, a heavy work activity is an activity that activates the proprioceptive system. So that's the system that takes in information from our muscles, joints, and tendons and tells us where we're at in the world. And we can't really move our bodies efficiently without that system. Okay. But heavy work activities, proprioception was taught in school as like the magic wand, because it can upregulate someone that needs more input, and it can downregulate someone that needs to be a little bit more calm.
Yeah.
And those activities are things that involve pushing, pulling, pushing, jumping, anything that's activating muscles and putting pressure through those joints.
Yeah. Those motor activities.
Yeah. Some of the classic things are like, carrying something that's heavy or pushing something that's heavy. And those activities tell our nervous system to kind of find this just right state. And what that activity looks like for different kids is obviously going to be different based on their age and their interest levels. But heavy work is always one of my go-to strategies to support kids.
That's awesome. Anything
my other
else?
one is breath work, respiratory type activities. Because when we breathe, it's like when you think about if you're stressed and someone tells you to take a deep breath, or you tell yourself to take a deep breath, breathing is a really organizing activity in our nervous system. And I use that a lot with kids. One of my go-tos is an activity called Bubble Mountain, where you take a big container and you put a bit of water in the bottom and a few drops of dish soap, and then you use like straws or some kind of tubing, like I use aquarium tubing, and you blow almost like you're blowing bubbles in milk, and they kind of stack up on themselves. But it really forces you to take that big, deep outward breath, and it cues your nervous system to relax.
I love that. And I'm also thinking, while you're talking about that, all of the oral motor exercises that you're getting while you're blowing on that straw and making those bubbles. And all kids love bubbles. That's awesome.
They really do. But even just blowing bubbles or pinwheels, all of those things are great activities to find that kind of just right state in our nervous system. So they're great activities to do before you're working on activities in your speech session, or for parents before they're asking their kid to do something that's a little tricky.
Yeah. Wow. Erika, I know we have just barely scraped the surface, but I'm so excited that you were here today, and I've learned so much. I love the techniques that you use. I think that's going to be super helpful. But I think just also understanding that these terms that we're hearing so often, that, it's something that we need to, and we've said this on the podcast before, my friend Dr. Hill that was on, that's an ABA, BCBA, asking for help. Your OTs are your go-to. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. My friends who are occupational therapists are my most brilliant friends. I don't know. OTs are like, when my daughter was little, I would call my OT friend sometimes before I would call the pediatrician, because she was like, oh, it's probably this. And 9 times out of 10, she was right. So you guys are brilliant. And Erika, I just really appreciate you being here today. It's been so much fun talking to you and learning about sensory integration, sensory disorders. If you guys have any questions, I'm going to put this out there. If you guys have any specific questions for Erika, go over to our SLP Full Disclosure TikTok and maybe post a question there, and we'll see if we can get Erika to answer it for us. I don't know how that will work. I'm sure that the people behind the scenes are like, Michelle, what are you doing? Don't do that. But yeah, let's try that. Let's see. Because I feel like we've talked about a lot of things, but we could probably sit here all day and really dive deep into sensory integration and sensory dysfunction and dysregulation and all of that. But gosh, thank you so much, Erika, for joining us. It has been super fun. You guys go over to the SLP Full Disclosure TikTok, leave a question for Erika, and we will get it to her somehow, and we will get your answer back to you. So I hope you guys have had a fun time listening, and we will see you next time. Bye. Thank you for tuning in to SLP Full Disclosure. You can learn more about this episode and our show on our website at amnhealthcare.com. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform. You can also find show updates and SLP opportunities on our Instagram at AMN Allied. Special thanks to AMN Healthcare for making this show possible. See y'all next time.